My name is Clara Novak, and until recently, I was the operations manager at Northwest Timber Products in Spokane, Washington. I dedicated 12 years of my life to that company. 12 years of early mornings, late nights, and countless hours spent refining systems, streamlining workflows, and building something that actually worked. When I first joined, Northwest was a mess. Outdated processes, high waste, frequent delivery errors, and client complaints piling up faster than the logs in our mill yard. I came on board right out of my MBA program, eager to prove myself and make a real impact. I started as a process analyst, diving into the data and spotting inefficiencies that had been overlooked for years. Slowly but steadily, I worked my way up the ranks. Under the leadership of our former CEO, Harold Bergman, I was given the trust and authority to overhaul our entire production model. Together, we transformed Northwest from a struggling regional player into one of the most respected timber companies in the Pacific Northwest. We implemented sustainable forestry practices, invested in modern equipment, and built strong, long-term relationships with key clients across Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. Our client retention rate hit 94%, and our efficiency metrics reached an all-time high. I wasn't just doing a job, I was building a legacy. Then Trevor RHS arrived. The board brought him in after Harold retired, hoping his flashy background in corporate strategy and disruptive innovation would take us to the next level. At first, I gave him the benefit of the doubt. He asked insightful questions, scheduled meetings with every department head, and even complimented my work. But soon, the red flags appeared. He brought in consultants who knew nothing about the timber industry, but loved to talk about culture alignment and brand synergy. He renovated the executive floor, complete with Italian leather chairs and an espresso bar, while ignoring my repeated requests for critical equipment upgrades. Team-building retreats replaced production deadlines. Buzzwords replaced strategy. Still, I adapted. I translated his vague directives into actionable plans. I buffered my team from the chaos and kept operations running smoothly. I believed, naively, that results would protect me, that if I kept the numbers strong and the clients happy, my job would be safe. I was wrong. One Friday morning, I was called into Trevor's office and informed that I was being replaced, effective immediately. My replacement? Greg Wilson, a man with zero manufacturing experience, no background in operations, and whose most recent job had been managing his family's car wash. I was told Greg shared Trevor's vision and would help modernize the company. It wasn't just a slap in the face, it was a dismantling of everything I had built. And the worst part? Trevor had already introduced Greg to the staff before even telling me I was out. My severance papers were waiting in my inbox before I left his office. 12 years of service, reduced to a 2-week transition period and a carefully worded email saying I was pursuing new opportunities. But what Trevor didn't know was that I wasn't going down quietly. I should have known something was off the moment Greg Wilson walked into my office. He had that easy charm, sun-kissed skin, too white smile, a golf polo under a blazer he clearly threw on last minute, and none of the poise or presence of someone stepping into a high-stakes operational role. He shook my hand like he was meeting the concierge at a resort. "Clara, great to finally meet you. Trevor's told me so much," he said, as if we were two old colleagues grabbing coffee, not a seasoned executive being replaced by a total outsider. Behind him, through the glass walls of the executive lounge, I could see Trevor watching us with a champagne flute in hand. He raised it slightly in my direction, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. I forced a polite smile and showed Greg around the office like a professional, even as my stomach churned. The man didn't know the difference between pine and cedar. He misnamed our largest client and couldn't read a production chart if his life depended on it. This wasn't a promotion, it was sabotage. As we walked the production floor, I kept my voice steady while explaining systems I'd spent years developing: real-time material tracking, vendor-integrated procurement, predictive scheduling algorithms. Greg scribbled in a leather-bound notebook without asking a single follow-up question. I asked where he'd worked before. He shrugged. My family runs a car wash business. I managed that for a while. Totally different industry, but business is business, right? I nearly laughed. I wanted to scream. Instead, I nodded. Later that afternoon, I overheard Greg and Trevor laughing behind the executive lounge's cracked door. She's still explaining systems like I'm actually going to use them, Greg chuckled. Wait till she finds out we're outsourcing half the ops to that consulting firm. Trevor's voice was low, but I caught every word. Board doesn't know that part yet. Let's get Claire out the door first. Then we frame it as a cost-saving initiative. I stood frozen outside the door. They were planning to gut my department, my team, and feed it to some outside firm with zero context or industry knowledge. Worse, they were hiding it from the board, manipulating the narrative to make it look like smart budgeting when it was really about control. Greg wasn't hired to manage operations. He was hired to be Trevor's puppet. That night, back in my office, I sat staring at the operations manual I'd been updating for Greg. I couldn't believe I had spent the afternoon training the person who was going to dismantle everything I built. 12 years of loyalty, efficiency, and results, reduced to a 2-week formality, a smokescreen for a hostile takeover of the company's core. I felt rage, yes, but also something more urgent, responsibility. My team had trusted me. Clients had relied on the systems I'd implemented. If this outsourcing plan went through, it wouldn't just cost jobs. It would threaten delivery schedules, compliance metrics, even our sustainability certifications. Trevor wasn't just pushing me out, he was jeopardizing the very foundation of Northwest Timber. The next day, I received an email from HR, reminder to sign my severance agreement. Attached was a confidentiality clause so tight it practically wrapped around my throat, no mention of the outsourcing plan. No reference to the fact that Greg had already started making executive decisions before even learning the difference between hardwood and softwood. I didn't sign it. Instead, I began quietly documenting everything. I reviewed board mandates, dug into past approvals, and started connecting dots. During a break room chat, I learned from accounting that Trevor's brother-in-law had just been hired as the purchasing director for Wilson Construction, one of our top clients. Trevor had taken him golfing last weekend. Coincidence? Please. By lunch, I'd uncovered whispers of preferential contract terms being drafted, 15% below market rate with guaranteed inventory during shortages. We'd never given those kinds of deals to anyone, ever. Trevor wasn't just playing politics. He was weaponizing the company for personal gain. And if no one stopped him, Northwest Timber would fall, not from poor performance, but from the inside out. The deeper I looked, the more disturbing the picture became. What Trevor and Greg were doing wasn't just an internal power shuffle. It was a calculated dismantling of our operations with potentially catastrophic consequences. And all of it, every shady deal and deceitful maneuver, was being hidden under the guise of modernization. By midweek, I'd begun piecing together a broader pattern. The Wilson Construction deal was just the tip of the iceberg. There were whispers of similar contracts being drafted for 2 other companies, both of which had personal connections to Trevor. One was run by a former colleague from his previous firm, the other by a friend who once hosted Trevor's wedding. All 3 contracts featured suspiciously generous terms, below market pricing, extended payment periods, and, most alarmingly, preferred supply guarantees. That last clause was particularly dangerous. In the timber industry, raw material allocation during shortages is governed by strict internal protocols. We prioritized long-standing clients based on volume, reliability, and payment history. Offering a preferential deal to an outside company for personal gain wasn't just unethical. It could lead to lawsuits if it affected our ability to meet other client obligations. Worse still, I couldn't trace any of these deals back to board approvals. Trevor had promised transparency when he was hired. He'd vowed to preserve our sustainable practices and involve the board in any structural changes. But according to the archived minutes I reviewed, nothing about outsourcing, contract restructuring, or executive realignment had ever been presented for a vote. The moment I realized this, something clicked. This wasn't incompetence. This was a cover-up. And I was in the way. I started documenting everything quietly, methodically. Every conversation, every odd directive, every moment that Greg slipped and revealed something he shouldn't have. I used my remaining access to save copies of reports and operational data that I suspected would be altered once I was gone. But by Thursday, even that lifeline started closing. I arrived at work to find my email credentials disabled. It told me, sheepishly, that it was per Trevor's direct request, in anticipation of your early departure. And I wasn't even allowed to send a goodbye email. It was a clear message. They didn't want me seeing anything I wasn't supposed to during the remainder of my so-called transition. Fortunately, I wasn't completely shut out. Thomas, my assistant of 7 years, still had full access. When I explained the situation, he didn't hesitate. You always told me to keep backups of everything. I did. He handed me a flash drive. Consultant contracts, drafted pricing sheets, client allocation memos. It's all there. I stared at him, floored. You kept all this? You trained me to be thorough, he said with a shrug. On that drive, I found exactly what I feared, and more. The consultant proposal for outsourcing operations was a disaster waiting to happen. The firm they were hiring had zero experience in timber logistics. The cost savings Trevor kept touting, only possible because the proposal excluded onboarding costs, systems training, and transition delays. Even worse, there were red flags around compliance. The proposal made no mention of how the new firm would maintain our environmental certifications, carbon offset tracking, or replanting metrics, all of which were foundational to our brand. If implemented, the plan wouldn't just gut our operations. It would violate several sustainability agreements we'd signed with both federal agencies and private watchdog groups. Fines, revoked certifications, PR nightmares. It was all on the table, and Trevor wanted to bulldoze through it before anyone noticed. There was no doubt now. Trevor was misleading the board, deliberately, systematically, and with the help of someone who didn't even understand the stakes. Greg didn't need to know the business. He was just there to smile, nod, and give Trevor cover while the real decisions happened behind closed doors. But Trevor underestimated one thing: I wasn't leaving quietly. I called Elaine Robinson that night, one of the few board members I trusted, a longtime ally of our former CEO, Harold. I laid out everything: the contracts, the consultant proposal, the access restrictions, and the clear breach of governance. Her response was immediate. You need proof, she said. Documentation, anything signed, emails, memos, directives. The board won't move on suspicion alone. I have it, I said. Then I want you at the next board meeting, Elaine replied. I'll get you in as a guest speaker on operational continuity, but be warned, Trevor will try to block you, and once he senses you're on to him, things will escalate fast. She wasn't wrong. The next morning, I walked into my office to find Greg already inside, rifling through my files. Just getting familiar, he said with a fake grin, since your last day might be sooner than expected. The trap was closing, but I had everything I needed to blow it wide open. I knew I had one shot to get this right. If I moved too fast, Trevor would bury everything before the board could see it. If I moved too slow, I'd be escorted out of the building and silenced under a non-disparagement clause. So I played along. That morning, Trevor summoned me into his office, smug and controlled, like a man who believed the game was already won. Clara, he said, lacing his fingers together, we've decided to end your transition early, effective immediately. I nodded slowly, pretending to be caught off guard. Is there a reason? He tilted his head. It's clear you're struggling to embrace the new direction. We believe it's best to close this chapter cleanly, for everyone's sake. I glanced at the revised severance agreement he slid across the desk. This time it included an even tighter non-disparagement clause and a veiled threat: sign today or lose everything. I understand, I said quietly. I'll review it and return it by the end of the day. That was the lie he needed to hear. Back at my office, I packed my personal items in a box with slow, deliberate motions. I kept my face neutral, allowing Greg and Trevor to believe they'd won. Greg even strutted by with a coffee in hand and a smirk that screamed overconfidence. Tough day, huh? He said. Tough year, I replied, my voice calm. By noon, I'd slipped Elaine a message through her personal email. "We're moving. I'll be ready for the board meeting. I have everything." She responded with a single line, "I've arranged your access." At 2:15 p.m., just as I was preparing to walk out with my dignity and my box, I heard Greg on the phone in the conference room speaking louder than he realized. "Yeah, we've cleared her out. She suspects nothing. The outsourcing launch is on track. The board will get the new strategy after implementation starts. Trevor's confident they'll have no choice but to go along." It took everything in me not to walk in and slam the door behind him, but I didn't. Instead, I let the door stay open. Let him think I was gone. Let him think I was defeated. Later that evening, I met with Elaine at a quiet cafe 2 miles from the office. She laid out the next step. The board's executive committee had agreed to hear me. Informally, off the record, no promises but a chance. But I'd been listed as a transition consultant, which would grant me access for the next few days, even without an official title. "I just need the facts," she said, looking me in the eye. "Nothing emotional, just numbers, policies, and proof." "You'll have it," I replied. The next morning, I returned to the office in a simple gray blazer and flats. No power dressing, no confrontation. I looked like someone who had accepted her fate, but I wasn't defeated. While Greg fumbled through sustainability compliance meetings, completely unprepared for the replanting data questions, I was quietly gathering the last pieces of evidence I needed. Thomas had already backed up the final pricing spreadsheets and consulting agreements. I organized the documentation by date, flagged every governance violation, and prepared a presentation so clear, so airtight, it would be impossible to ignore. Trevor believed I was gone. Greg believed I was irrelevant. That was their first mistake. The day of the board's executive committee meeting began like any other. Trevor strutted through the office with the smug confidence of someone who thought he'd already won. Greg lingered behind him like a shadow, still out of his depth, but convinced he had a front-row seat to power. I walked into the building as quietly as I could, escorted by James Werner, the board chair himself, who met me at the security desk. "Elaine told me what's going on," he said in a low voice. "We'll give you the floor. Just stick to the facts." "I will," I said, clutching the folder of documents I had spent the last week assembling. Upstairs, the executive boardroom felt colder than usual. Mahogany table, polished glass walls, 10 chairs, only half of them occupied. Trevor was already seated, Greg beside him, both visibly unsettled by my presence. Elaine sat across from them, flanked by 2 other committee members. "Clara," Trevor said, feigning surprise. "I don't believe you were invited to this meeting." "She's here at my request," James replied firmly. "Given the recent concerns raised about operational changes, I believe her insight is not only relevant, but necessary." Trevor's face tightened. Greg's eyes darted to the door like he wanted to leave. "Let's begin," James said. I stood, opened my folder, and began. "Over the past 12 years, I've overseen every operational system within Northwest Timber Products," I said. "What I'm about to present are structural changes that not only contradict the company's sustainability commitments, but also violate board governance protocols and expose us to serious financial and legal risks." I laid out the consultant contract first, showing how the outsourcing proposal, already partially implemented, had bypassed board approval. I pointed to the glaring issues: lack of compliance tracking, no defined onboarding process, hidden transition costs disguised as savings. One chart compared current operational costs with projected costs from the proposal, after factoring in penalties, inefficiencies, and risk exposure. The result? A net increase of nearly 18%, despite Trevor's promise of cost reductions. Trevor shifted in his seat. I moved on. Next were the client contracts, Wilson Construction, plus 2 others. Each one showed below-market pricing, extended terms, and exclusive supply guarantees during shortages, something we had never offered, not even to our most loyal clients. The final pages revealed that all 3 companies were directly tied to Trevor's personal network. I paused, then added, "These preferential deals compromise our relationships with existing clients, violate our standard allocation policies, and risk breaching our own ethical supply agreements." Silence. Then I dropped the final piece, Trevor's own email directive to Greg, instructing him to move forward with outsourcing prior to board presentation. So by the time they see it, it's already too late to object. I slid printed copies across the table. No spin, no embellishment, just facts. James scanned the document slowly, his expression turning grim. Elaine stared directly at Trevor, her jaw tight. "Trevor," James said, "is this accurate?" Trevor leaned forward, his tone defensive. "This is a gross mischaracterization. Clara is clearly bitter about her departure and is twisting details to paint me in a negative light." "The documents speak for themselves," I interrupted calmly. "Every number, every contract, every directive has a timestamp and a digital signature. This isn't bitterness, it's governance." Greg looked like he wanted to melt into the floor. Elaine finally spoke. "Trevor, you've made sweeping changes to core operations without board approval. You've exposed the company to compliance risk, and you've awarded contracts that directly benefit people in your personal circle. That's not modernization, that's misconduct." "I was going to present everything at the next full meeting," Trevor insisted. "No," James said flatly. "You were going to bury us in paperwork and assume we'd rubber stamp it after the damage was done." He turned to me. "Clara, thank you. Please wait outside while we deliberate." I left the boardroom without a word, my heart pounding, not from nerves, but from the adrenaline of finally speaking truth to power. I had done everything I could. Now it was up to them. 30 minutes later, James emerged. "Trevor's been terminated, effective immediately. Greg will not be assuming any leadership role, and the outsourcing plan is rescinded in full." I nodded, swallowing the surge of emotion. "We'll also be auditing all executive decisions made since Trevor's hiring," James added. "You've saved this company from what could have been an irreversible disaster." The fallout was swift and brutal. By the end of that same day, Trevor was escorted out of the building by corporate security. No farewell party, no final words, just a tense walk down the executive hallway as staff members looked on in stunned silence. I didn't watch it happen, but Thomas later told me that Trevor didn't even pack up his office himself. He left behind his designer nameplate, his espresso machine, and the illusion of control. Greg didn't last much longer. Once the board realized he had no operational knowledge and that he had knowingly participated in the cover-up, they quietly removed him from the building. He never even got to finish his coffee. The last I heard, he was back in California trying to consult for small businesses and explaining away his sudden exit from Northwest as a strategic disagreement. Word spreads fast in our industry. No one was buying it. The board acted decisively. All preferential contracts were suspended pending legal review. The consultant agreement was torn up before implementation could begin. Elaine personally led the effort to restore transparency and order to the operational review process. And while James was initially hesitant to launch a full audit, he changed his mind when more questionable expenses under Trevor's name surfaced, including lavish client dinners that never actually involved clients. Internally, the company was shaken, but grateful. My former team reached out with messages of support, relief, and quiet celebration. The systems I had built, the ones Trevor wanted to erase, remained intact. In fact, they were now held up as the model for how Northwest should continue. Sustainable, efficient, and built on expertise, not ego. A few days later, James and Elaine called me back to the office. This time, I sat at the head of the boardroom table. "We'd like you to return," James said. "Full authority over operations, a compensation adjustment, whatever you need." It was a moment I'd dreamed of, in some version, during the worst days of the transition. But now that it was real, I felt something shift inside me. "I'm honored," I said, "but I think it's time for me to move on." They looked surprised. "I've had 2 offers in the past week," I explained, "and I think I need a fresh start. But I'm willing to stay through a structured transition, help you stabilize, onboard the right person, and ensure the company doesn't lose momentum." Elaine nodded with respect. "We'll make that arrangement." Over the next 3 months, I stayed on as a strategic consultant, rebuilding trust within the team, closing the gaps left behind, and advising the board on long-term safeguards. When I finally did leave, it was on my terms, with my reputation not only intact, but stronger than ever. And Trevor? He threatened legal action, claimed I had leaked confidential materials, and sent one last venomous email to the board. James responded with a single line: "Any legal inquiry will trigger a full audit of all decisions made during your tenure." We never heard from him again. Sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's delivered in quiet meetings, silent nods, and the sound of a closing door behind someone who thought they'd never lose. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do when someone tries to erase you is to prove that you were never replaceable in the first place. About 2 weeks after my formal exit from Northwest Timber, just as I was settling into a quieter rhythm and preparing for the next chapter, I received a call from a journalist. She introduced herself as a senior writer for an industry publication that covered corporate governance and sustainability in manufacturing. "We've received a packet of internal documents," she said. "They detail some concerning contract arrangements and strategic shifts at Northwest Timber under Trevor RHS. Your name came up as someone who may have insight." I kept my voice even. "I'm no longer with the company." "I understand," she replied. "Off the record, thank you for your time." I hadn't leaked anything, but someone clearly had, and while I had my suspicions, I didn't ask questions. Some battles are better fought through silence. The article dropped 4 days later. "Vision or Exploitation: The Rise and Fall of a Timber Executive," read the headline. It was explosive. The journalist had done her homework, citing interviews with anonymous employees, pulling financial comparisons, and most notably, revealing that Trevor had a pattern of similar misconduct at his former firm. Turns out, Northwest was not the first company he'd tried to modernize by gutting experienced teams and funneling contracts to personal connections. It was just the first company where someone had stopped him before the damage became irreversible. The article went viral in the industry. Executives shared it on LinkedIn. Clients called Northwest asking for clarification. 2 of the companies named in the Sweetheart deals saw immediate reputational damage. One lost a state-level forestry partnership. The other had its government contract flagged for review. And Trevor, gone, blacklisted. He issued a single statement through a lawyer denying all wrongdoing, but it barely registered. His name, once associated with innovation, was now synonymous with ethical failure. Greg quietly vanished. No new job postings, no LinkedIn updates. Rumor had it he moved back to California to take a break. And me? I'd just signed a contract to become director of operations at a sustainable building materials firm, expanding into engineered timber. They had followed the entire Northwest situation closely and reached out after the article, impressed not just by my operational track record, but by my integrity. "We don't just want someone who knows systems," the CEO told me. "We want someone who can lead through storms." It was the validation I didn't know I needed. Even better? Over the following months, 5 of my former team members joined me at the new company. Engineers, analysts, and project managers I had trained, mentored, and trusted. We were building something new, rooted in the same values Trevor had tried to erase: transparency, accountability, and long-term vision. As for Northwest, they stabilized. The board became more involved, instituted new oversight processes, and recommitted to sustainable practices. I continued consulting with them periodically, quietly, behind the scenes, not for recognition, but because I still cared about the company I helped shape. Looking back now, I realize the story wasn't just about revenge or redemption. It was about what happens when someone tries to erase your legacy, and you choose to defend it not with rage, but with clarity, precision, and truth. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say isn't loud or dramatic. It's showing the world what you're capable of after the door closes, and letting your actions speak louder than any severance package ever could.
Evan slapped my nameplate off the table with a flick of his wrist, letting it clatter to the floor. He grinned at the sound, then dropped into my chair as if he had earned the right to sit there. Stretching his legs wide, he sneered. "The relics had her time." My colleagues froze. eyes darting anywhere but at me. Their silence carved me deeper than Evan's insult, proof that fear of Richard Huxley's power outweighed loyalty to me. And then Richard himself entered. Richard Huxley, the white patriarch of Huxley Energy Systems, moved like he owned not just the room, but the air inside it. His silver hair, polished suit, and practiced smile radiated control. He didn't chastise Evan for the humiliation. Instead, he set a hand proudly on his nephew's shoulder and announced, "Effective immediately. Ophelia Morgan will step aside. Evan will take charge." 18 years of my life, discarded in one breath. Moments like that remind me how important it is to pause and take care of ourselves, even in small ways. Have you taken a short walk today to stretch your legs and clear your mind? I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop it in the comments, and if this story resonates with you, tap like and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I am Ophelia Morgan, daughter of a Black mother and an Irish father, proof that hard work can break barriers, though it never erases them. For nearly 2 decades, I was the director of transaction integrity, the quiet architect ensuring that $3.6 billion flowed without error each quarter. Every safeguard, every seamless transfer bore my design. While Richard entertained reporters and Evan partied across Europe, I sacrificed weekends, holidays, and family dinners to keep the empire upright. And now, nepotism erased me. The contrast was unbearable. Richard stood tall, polished, every inch the corporate king. Evan lounged in my seat, lazy entitlement written on his smirk. And me, the woman who had kept their fortune alive, was reduced to a bystander in the room I had built. No applause followed Richard's decree. No protest rose either. My colleagues bowed their heads, bound by fear, complicit in my erasure. Shock hollowed me. Humiliation burned hotter than rage. In that moment, I realized the truth. My loyalty had never been legacy. To them, I had only ever been disposable. They erased me quietly, as if deleting a line from a file. One morning, I opened the latest quarterly report expecting to see my name listed under Director of Transaction Integrity, as it had been for years. Instead, the line was blank. My contributions had vanished, absorbed into the new narrative of Huxley family leadership. When I asked the communications team what had happened, they avoided my eyes, muttered something about updates, and shuffled away. It didn't stop there. In the company's promotional video, I had once appeared for a split second, standing beside servers I had designed, smiling awkwardly but proud of the work. That clip was gone now, replaced with a staged shot of Evan shaking Richard's hand, as though his arrival had powered 18 years of progress. Watching it made my stomach knot. I went to my manager's office for clarification, but the secretary told me politely that I no longer needed to attend upcoming press briefings. "They've shifted focus," she said. The words were meant to sound neutral, but they landed like a verdict. I was invisible. The final blow came in the hallway later that week. A younger colleague I had mentored, bright-eyed, barely 3 years into the job, pulled me aside nervously. He leaned in close and whispered, "They don't want your face representing billions of dollars. That's what they're saying upstairs." The words hollowed me. I felt heat rise in my chest, not from shock, but from recognition. For years, I had known the truth, that my biracial face didn't fit Richard's image of polished white continuity. I had convinced myself that results mattered more than optics. But now the mask was gone. They had chosen a legacy of appearances over the substance of my labor. That night, I returned to my office only to find it stripped down. My files had been boxed and stacked in the corner. A placard reading "Temporary Workspace" hung on the door. I had been reassigned to a windowless side room next to the storage cabinets. The message was clear. I no longer belonged in sight. Each day in that cramped space, Resentment grew heavier. I could still hear the cheers from the main floor whenever Evan passed by. His cologne thick, his laughter careless. Meanwhile, I sat in silence, watching dust gather on the blinds. My years of devotion reduced to a ghost position. I wasn't just excluded, I was erased, and invisibility. I realized, was a cruelty sharper than dismissal? At least being fired would have given me an end. Instead, they let me fade, hoping I would accept the shadows without a fight. But as resentment burned hotter, a thought took root. Shadows may hide you, but they also give you room to prepare. Richard's voice carried across the boardroom like scripture, smooth and confident, every syllable dripping with conviction. Legacy outlives skill, he declared to the directors seated around the polished mahogany table. The Huxley name stands for stability, continuity, and trust. That is what our investors want. That is what we will give them. I sat at the far end, my hands tightening into fists beneath the table. Legacy, a word he used like armor, a word that erased the years I had bled into this company, trading holidays for crisis calls, sacrificing sleep for flawless audits. To Richard, competence was temporary, disposable. Legacy was eternal. Beside him, Evan nodded solemnly, as though he understood the weight of his uncle's words. But I knew better. Evan could barely spell half the terms I had spent my career mastering. He lived on shortcuts, charm, and Richard's protection. The very next week, Evan was paraded in front of one of our largest clients, an international energy fund with contracts worth billions. I was not invited. Of course. I learned about the meeting through whispers in the hallway, sitting in my windowless side room. I imagined the scene unfolding. Richard, glowing with pride, introducing Evan as the future of Huxley leadership. But what I pictured was not far from what actually happened. Later, one of the junior staffers who had attended told me in hushed tones how Evan stumbled over basic concepts, confusing kilowatts with megawatts, misreading a critical financial chart. The client's representatives exchanged glances, their smiles strained. Evan, oblivious, kept talking, throwing around buzzwords he didn't understand. I waited for fallout. Surely, I thought, the press would seize on his incompetence, or the board would question Richard's reckless gamble. But when the article appeared the next day, the headline read, "Huxley Energy's Next Generation Inspires Confidence in Global Investors." Bitterness curdled in my stomach. The journalist quoted Richard extensively, praising the company's commitment to family continuity. Evan's blunders had been erased, replaced with a polished narrative of vision and strength. The board, too, remained silent. In the next meeting, they nodded along as Richard spun tales of a promising future under Evan's leadership. I saw the gleam in their eyes, not conviction, but greed. I knew why. Richard had padded their dividends, buying loyalty one check at a time. Their silence was bought, their complicity sealed. Anger simmered inside me, sharp and steady. It wasn't just that I had been cast aside. It was that truth itself was being smothered. Reality didn't matter. Results didn't matter. Legacy was the story they sold, and money ensured no one questioned it. I sat alone in my small office that evening, bitterness gnawing at me, anger hardening into resolve. If they wanted to erase competence in favor of legacy, then I would show them what happens when legacy stands on nothing but lies. The building was different after hours. The glass towers that gleamed with confidence by day turned into shadows and silence by night. I swiped my old badge at the back entrance, half expecting the red light to betray me. Somehow, the reader blinked green, and the door clicked open. My pulse quickened. Every step echoed louder than I wanted, bouncing off marble floors and empty corridors. The daytime bustle of executives and assistants was gone. leaving only the hum of air conditioning and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. I wasn't supposed to be here, not anymore. But I couldn't walk away, not while Richard and Evan built their empire on the ruins of my work. I slipped into my old office, only to find my desktop dark and lifeless. When I pressed the power button, a message appeared. Access denied. Account disabled. My heart sank. They hadn't just pushed me aside, they had erased me completely. I needed another way. My fingers traced the edge of a cardboard box still tucked beneath my desk. Inside, I kept a few stray documents, a half-broken coffee mug, and the contact card of a former colleague who had left quietly 2 years earlier. She'd given me her old company laptop once, saying it might come in handy. At the time. I laughed. Tonight. I was grateful. I retrieved the battered laptop from the trunk of my car, its keys worn smooth, its battery barely holding charge, connecting it to the company's guest Wi-Fi. I prayed the outdated machine still remembered a few back doors. Just as I settled into a rhythm, the sound of footsteps jolted me upright. A flashlight beam swept across the hallway. A security guard. My chest tightened as the light neared the door. "Ms. Morgan?" he called softly. Surprise in his tone. I forced a smile, grabbing the cardboard box and holding it up like a shield. "Just picking up the last of my things. Didn't want to make a scene during the day." He studied me for a long second, then nodded. "Make it quick." His footsteps faded, but my hands still shook. The pressure weighed heavy, but I pressed on. Lines of code scrolled across the old laptop screen. Directories opening one by one. Files began to appear. Financial logs, server reports, hidden folders. Proof was there. Proof of what Richard had stolen. Determination steadied my hands. The company had locked me out, boxed me away, tried to make me invisible. But invisibility has its advantages. No one saw me gathering the truth. Piece by piece. In the quiet hours, they thought I was gone. I knew I was risking everything by being there, but I couldn't turn back. What do you think I'll uncover in those hidden files? Stay with me until the end. Because what's coming next will change everything. The files loaded slowly, like reluctant witnesses being dragged into the light. At first, they looked like ordinary transaction logs, columns of numbers, dates, and account IDs. But patterns began to emerge, gaps where there shouldn't be, transfers routed through shell accounts I didn't recognize. The further I dug, the colder my blood ran. These weren't simple errors. Richard had been siphoning money from the company's employee retirement fund, millions of dollars meant to secure the futures of men and women who had given decades of their lives to Huxley Energy Systems. Money promised to secretaries, engineers, analysts, custodians. Gone. Hidden to patch holes in quarterly losses and prop up the illusion of stability. Shock hit first, numbing me. I thought of Gerald from payroll, who had worked 35 years and once told me his pension would be the only reason he could send his granddaughter to college. I thought of Marlene in accounting, 2 years from retirement, trusting that her check would carry her through her final years. Their sacrifices had been stolen, funneled into Richard's glossy empire. Then I found the line that made my hands shake with fury. Several transactions bore my name, my digital signature. At least, what looked like mine. Transfers of hundreds of thousands into hidden offshore accounts had been authorized under Ophelia Morgan. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. Richard hadn't just stolen, he had framed me to cover his theft. If this ever went public without context, I would be the scapegoat, the villain who raided the pensions of loyal employees. Righteous anger burned away the shock. How many times had I carried this company through crises? How many times had I sacrificed my life outside these walls to protect its integrity? And this was how Richard repaid me, by using my name as a shield for his crimes. But anger didn't erase fear. I knew Richard's reach. If I went public too quickly, He could erase the evidence with one phone call to IT, wiping the servers clean before anyone believed me. Worse, he could spin the story, paint me as a bitter ex-employee, sabotaging the company after being replaced. The weight of it pressed down. But beneath the fear was clarity. For 18 years, I had lived by integrity, by the belief that numbers don't lie and truth always matters. Richard had crossed a line that could not be ignored. I copied everything to the old laptop, my fingers moving faster now, adrenaline steadying them. Each file was a weapon, each forged signature, a nail in the coffin of his empire. I didn't know yet how to use them, but I knew one thing with certainty. Richard Huxley had stolen from the very people who trusted him most, and I would not let him bury that truth. Trust had always been my currency, for years. Colleagues leaned on me in crisis, confided in me when systems buckled under pressure. But in the weeks after I uncovered Richard's theft, I felt that currency turn to dust. It started with a strange silence. Friends who used to stop by my cramped side office no longer lingered. Conversations hushed when I walked into the cafeteria. Smiles grew thin, replaced by wary glances. I told myself it was in my head, a symptom of sleepless nights and too much coffee. But then the proof arrived. One evening, an anonymous message slid into my personal inbox. "He knows. Someone told him you're still around." No name, no context, just those words. My chest tightened. I replayed every conversation I'd had, every cautious hello from old colleagues. Which of them had whispered to Evan? Who had traded my trust for Richard's favor? The answer came the next morning, disguised as arrogance. A single email from Evan appeared in my work account, an account I wasn't supposed to have anymore. The subject line, relic. The body contained just 4 words. Old habits die hard. I stared at the screen, bile rising in my throat. He knew I was digging, that I hadn't quietly disappeared like they expected. And he wanted me to feel cornered, mocked, powerless. Paranoia settled into my bones. Every footstep in the hallway felt heavier. Every glance lingered too long. Even the janitor's keys jingling in the darkened corridor made me flinch. That night, when I tried to access the backup server, a system I had relied on for years, the door slammed shut. My login attempts returned error after error. Access blocked. Account disabled. Panic pricked at the edges of my resolve. Without the backup servers, I was walking a tightrope with no net. If Richard scrubbed the main system, the evidence I had gathered could vanish in an instant. The isolation was suffocating. I couldn't trust anyone. I couldn't risk asking for help. Even the young analyst who once warned me about my face not fitting the brand avoided eye contact now, slipping past me in the halls as if my very presence was radioactive. I sat in my small, windowless office, the walls closing in. My laptop hummed weakly, the stolen files glowing on the screen like fragile embers. I knew I was one power surge, one server wipe, one false move away from losing everything. And yet, beneath the paranoia, determination refused to die. They wanted me silenced, invisible, erased. But the more they tightened their grip, the more certain I became I wasn't the relic. I was the reckoning they feared. The clock ticked louder than it should have, each second pounding in my ears as though mocking me. My laptop sat on the desk, the screen glowing faintly. The evidence spread across dozens of encrypted files, months of late nights, weeks of fear, and 18 years of loyalty condensed into one fragile case. I worked feverishly, combing through every document, every forged signature, every trail that led back to Richard's theft. My fingers shook, not from uncertainty of the facts, they were solid, but from the weight of what it meant. If I failed, if I missed one detail, the man who had erased me would not only survive, he would destroy me completely. I compressed the files into a single encrypted folder, layering passwords and codes only I could untangle. My heart pounded as I wrote the cover letter to the investigators. I kept it simple, factual, impossible to ignore. I clicked send just hours before the grand public event, where Richard and Evan would present their shining vision of the company's future. For a moment, relief washed over me. I had done it. The truth was out. But minutes passed. Then an hour, no reply, no confirmation, nothing but silence. Desperation clawed at me. I refreshed my inbox over and over, hoping for the ping of acknowledgement. Nothing came. My chest tightened, and doubt slithered in. What if the files never reached them? What if Richard had already intercepted my attempt? What if I had just handed him the rope to hang me with? As the doubt grew, another threat appeared. A warning flashed across the screen. Battery low, 5% remaining. Panic surged. My charger. Where was it? I tore through drawers, lifted stacks of papers, crawled under the desk. Heart racing. I had left it at home. My breath caught in my throat. If the laptop died, the only copy of the files, the case I had built brick by brick, would vanish. I scrambled, copying what I could onto a flash drive, my fingers clumsy, sweat stinging my eyes. Progress bars crawled across the screen like cruel jokes. 2% battery remaining. My lips whispered a prayer I hadn't spoken since childhood. The screen dimmed, flickered, then stabilized long enough for the transfer to finish. I clutched the flash drive in my hand, my pulse hammering, but the victory felt hollow. The silence from the investigators still pressed down. Heavier than ever, 18 years of sacrifice, and all I had to show for it was a dying laptop, a fragile flash drive, and a pit in my stomach telling me I had already lost. As the battery finally gave out and the room sank into darkness, I sat frozen. Doubt whispered that maybe Richard was right, that people like me could be erased without consequence. And for the first time, I wondered if all my effort had been for nothing. He ballroom gleamed under chandeliers, cameras flashing like lightning as the press packed shoulder to shoulder. A giant banner stretched across the stage. Huxley Energy, a legacy of leadership. The word legacy burned in my mind like acid. I stood in the shadows near the back, hidden behind a pillar, watching Evan stride to the podium. His suit was slightly rumpled, his tie crooked, but none of that mattered. The reporters shouted his name, the cameras devoured his every grin. Richard beamed beside him, introducing his nephew as the bright future of the company. Every word tightened the knot in my chest. Rage rose, hot and sharp. 18 years of my blood, sweat, and sacrifices had built the foundation beneath their feet. And yet I was invisible, erased as though I had never existed. My name was gone from the reports, my face scrubbed from the videos, my voice silenced, and now I was forced to watch the man who called me a relic bask in glory that wasn't his. The despair that followed was worse. What if the silence from the investigators meant my files were gone? Lost in some digital void? What if Richard had already buried the truth under his mountain of influence and money? Around me, colleagues clapped loudly, their applause echoing in the hall, while I shrank into the background, suffocating in invisibility. My nails dug into my palms as Evan stumbled through a sentence about financial resilience and mispronounced a key investor's name. The audience laughed kindly, indulgently, as though mistakes were charming quirks rather than incompetence. My jaw tightened. If I had made a slip like that, I would have been crucified. For him. It was brushed aside. The double standard carved another wound into me. Then, through the sea of cheers and cameras, a hand touched my arm gently. I turned to find an older man in a gray suit, his face lined, but his eyes steady. Mr. Langford, one of the company's oldest investors, leaned close and whispered, "You don't deserve this. I've watched you for years." For the first time that night, I nearly broke. His words cracked through the wall of rage and despair, leaving me raw and trembling. Someone had noticed. Someone had seen me, even if only in secret. Before I could answer, the crowd's roar swelled as Evan finished his speech. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, hands shaking. A single message glowed on the screen from the investigators. Received, reviewing. The world seemed to still. The fury that had consumed me, the despair that had threatened to drown me, suddenly, a thread of hope pierced through. It was faint, fragile, but it was there. My evidence hadn't disappeared. The truth was in someone's hands. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, standing straighter in the shadows. I was still invisible to the crowd, but deep inside, I knew invisibility wouldn't last forever. Evan's voice droned through the speakers, amplified by microphones and flanked by giant screens projecting his face across the ballroom. The crowd clapped on cue, cameras flashing, investors nodding as if they were watching history being made. To me, it felt like watching a theater production, bright lights, polished lines, and not a shred of truth. I kept glancing at my phone, willing it to light up again. The investigators had sent only one brief acknowledgement. Received, reviewing. That was nearly half an hour ago. Since then, silence. No follow-up, no confirmation, just an endless void. My chest tightened. What if this was it? What if the files vanished into bureaucracy, buried under red tape while Richard solidified his lie? The ballroom air felt heavier, as though the chandeliers themselves were pressing down on me. For a flicker of a moment, I thought about walking away. 18 years of loyalty already gone. Why sacrifice what little strength I had left? But grim resolve pushed back. I couldn't leave. Too many lives depended on those pensions, on the truth surfacing, even if I had to stand here invisible, humiliated. I had to see this through. Evan shuffled his note cards, pausing for effect. The screens zoomed in on his grin. "Our future is secure," he said with smug certainty, mispronouncing another financial term. The crowd still applauded. My nails dug crescents into my palms. 28 minutes. My phone screen stayed blank. I tried to steady my breath, but anxiety chewed at every corner of my mind. Each second felt like a nail in the coffin of my evidence. Each cheer from the crowd, another shovel of dirt burying me alive. Then, 29 minutes. A vibration buzzed in my hand. I looked down. One notification glowed across my phone. Emergency freeze order executed. My throat closed. For a heartbeat, I couldn't breathe. Then the words sank in. The order had gone through. The accounts were frozen. Richard's empire, 3.6 billion of it, was locked. The ballroom hadn't caught on yet. The screens still showed Evan's grin, his voice carrying on as if nothing had changed. But phones started buzzing across the room. Whispers rippled between investors. Brows furrowed, confusion spreading like cracks in glass. I lifted my gaze, scanning the crowd. That's when I saw Mr. Langford. He wasn't clapping. He wasn't smiling. He looked straight across the room at Richard, then turned his eyes to me. And he nodded. A small, deliberate gesture, recognition, vindication, proof that at least one person understood the shift. Richard's confident smile faltered as a man in the front row hurriedly checked his device and whispered something urgent. Evan froze mid-sentence, eyes darting to his uncle for guidance. The room's energy shifted, applause fading into uneasy murmurs. My phone still glowed with those words. Emergency freeze order executed. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe. The anxiety didn't vanish, but it transformed. It wasn't the dread of waiting anymore. It was the weight of knowing the reckoning had begun. The ballroom dissolved into chaos. Investors scrambled for their phones. Reporters barked questions into microphones, and the flashing cameras no longer focused on Evan's smug grin. Instead, they captured Richard's paling face as whispers of the freeze order spread like wildfire. $3.6 billion locked. Accounts frozen. Regulatory investigation. The words echoed across the hall in frantic tones. The chandeliers glittered above, but the glow of wealth had vanished. All that remained was panic. My phone buzzed again, this time with Richard's name. I let it ring once, twice. Before I answered, his voice was sharp, desperate. "Ophelia, what have you done?" I stepped away from the shadows, my voice steady. I didn't collapse your empire. Richard, the truth did." The words cut the air clean, and for the first time, I felt the weight of humiliation lift from my shoulders. On the main screen behind the podium, a message appeared in bold letters. Case initiated based on evidence provided by Ophelia Morgan. My name, for so long erased, now stood larger than life. Gasps spread through the crowd as cameras swiveled, searching for me. Evan fumbled his note cards. His cheeks flushed red. Richard froze, caught between rage and fear, his empire unraveling in real time. The very men on the board who had once bowed to him now whispered nervously, calculating their escape. I walked toward the exit slowly, deliberately. As reporters shouted questions, I had no intention of answering, for the first time in years. I didn't feel invisible. Every step I took was no longer weighed down by their silence. It was buoyed by recognition, by justice, outside. The night air was cool against my face. The noise of the chaos inside dulled to a distant roar. I exhaled deeply. The bitterness that had clung to me replaced with a clarity I hadn't known in years. For 18 years. They had taken my labor, my loyalty, my dignity, tonight. I reclaimed them all, for the first time. I wasn't just Ophelia Morgan, the employee. I was Ophelia Morgan, the witness, the truth-teller, the reckoning they could never erase. No matter how powerful they seem, no lie survives forever. Truth waits, and when it arrives, it shatters even the strongest walls of corruption. What about you? Have you ever been silenced, or made to feel invisible after giving everything? Share your story in the comments. If this journey struck a chord, tap like. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of resilience and justice.